Hi there everyone, Lars here from Camille's Harem. Not just a podcast for novice writers by novice writers, but also a YouTube channel by novice writers for novice writers. Because writing is an adventure, it's more fun with friends. And in this video, I want to finally close the door on the Rings of Power Season 1 and move forward. And one of the best ways I feel like I can do this is to go over some of the lessons that I think all writers and creatives can really learn from this obvious defeat and dumpster fire. Now, I mean, I can give a couple of parting pot shots to what we've seen here in this show because really and truly, it was a disaster. I mean, I looked at the show from the perspective as a fan, and then also from the perspective as if Tolkien never existed, so that way that bias was gone. What would it be like? And the best praise I could give it was that it was a well-written first draft for at least the first few episodes, but after that it started falling apart. And there were some characters and interactions that I liked, but unfortunately a lot of subplots went nowhere, or these characters were undermined by just awful writing. The storytelling was all over the place. The story was bogged down with member berries and deep lore that was then contradicted by the actual lore that they wanted to suck up to. So the story was just, it was weirdly enough just all over the place. Fans of Tolkien really couldn't get into it because of how it desecrated his legacy, and then people who didn't understand Tolkien's lore, who aren't fans and were just looking for a good show to watch, were largely disappointed because they didn't understand what was going on. I personally believe that in the future there will be classes taught about why this show failed so bad, why it is something that you don't even want to try to replicate on any sort of level other than maybe how you can get $1 billion budgets, that way you can blow through it on your own project. Because even down to the costumes and the cinematography, the action, everything, a lot of people who are in the industry, who are in the know, have raked this show through the mud. And as a novice author alone, I can just say, look, from what I've experienced with my writing, this right here was not a well-written show. I can applaud them for at least trying, but I am not going to give them many kudos beyond that. And for anyone who's like, well, what do you know? You just said you're a novice author. This is very true. I actually did some math. If all of the scripts for the entire show, seasons 1 through 5, are already written and ready to go, I have actually written more and published more under my own name than the showrunners for The Lord of the Rings. Yes, I actually have. Once again, I went and did the math, and I was even liberal in what I gave to them. Most shows, even most movie scripts, do not breach 20,000 words. But I was like, hey, you know what? I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt and said that they went really into it, that they gave all kinds of insights and dialogue and great notes. 20,000 words, easy. So then you multiply that by 40, because that's as many episodes as we are supposed to be getting, supposedly. And there's 800,000 words. Easy. And probably a little bit more. Let's even say 900,000 words. They've written 900,000 words in their first draft show. Awesome. I have published almost 1.5 million words across all of my books and other projects, which have been edited profusely before being released. So I have been there, I have done the work. Even though I count myself still as a novice author, I am qualified on some level to give us some insight into what we can learn from this debacle and disaster of a show. So I have 10 lessons that I wish to get into. 10 lessons that any writer, any creative, any cinematographer, any video or filmmaker can easily learn from in order to improve their craft. Lesson number 1, know your audience. I've brought this up in other videos, but I'm definitely going to stress it here. You have to know your audience. When I was taking video production, and this is back in high school, my teacher, Mr. Abel, would immediately dock us points. He would actually go to his gradebook and dock you points if you could not answer this question. What is the first thing you should do before you do anything else in terms of pre-production? The answer to that question is know your audience. Who is my audience? You have to know this. When it comes to writing, sure, you can say, well, I'm writing for myself. And if you intend to never publish any of your stories, awesome. You know who you're writing for. But if you're writing fan fiction, or if you're going to write a show, if you're going to write a book, you have to know who you are writing to. Yes, you should always be writing for yourself because you have to enjoy what you are writing. But if you intend to sell your story, if you intend to share your story out there with the rest of the world, you need to know your audience. One of the reasons why this is crucial is because you have to know what then to put in, because you then have to know what to put into this story. I'll give you actually an example from one of my own stories. I have this really neat idea for a kid's story involving animals and magic in another world. And it's something that I've had on the back burner now for years. I work on it on and off. In fact, you can even go check out on Royal Roads. I wrote a couple of chapters for it before I discontinued it because I was like, I don't like where this is going. But it's a great kid's story. The thing, though, is that while I was developing it, I wanted to put in some more mature themes and scenes into the story. And suddenly I'm like, wait a second, but I'm writing this for kids. I can't put this in here because of kids, because they would be inappropriate to give to kids. The kids wouldn't understand it when they then go and tell their parents, I don't understand what's happening in this book. The parents would get upset with me, and yeah, that's on me. If I don't know my audience, I have to write to my audience. I have to write at a level that they understand and put in stuff that they understand. The more mature you write for, the more you can put in. But even then, understand who you're writing to. And don't then think, oh, because I'm writing to a mature audience, I can do whatever I want. No, so many creatives do that, and that is insulting to the audience. It really is, or it just goes over their heads, or it makes no sense. You have to say, I am writing to people who want drama. I'm writing to people who want mature romance. I'm writing to people who want teenage romance. I'm writing to people who want a great children's adventure story. I'm writing to people who want something along the lines of Indiana Jones. So I'm going to write to Indiana Jones fans. That is what you need to know because it really, really does help you understand what you should put into your story and what you shouldn't. When we think about the Rings of Power, who was their audience? If their audience were Tolkien fans, why did they desecrate the lore so much? They had the rights to it. They should have used it. Tolkien mapped almost everything out for them, and if they had stuck to it, they could have done amazing things, and they could have embellished it with their own original characters still, and have still been respectful to the lore and to the fans. But they didn't do that. So they obviously didn't write for the fans of Tolkien, but then they put in so many Tolkienisms and all these other weird things and stuff that really didn't make any sense unless you knew the concrete and deep lore of Tolkien, that people who weren't fans of Tolkien couldn't keep up with the story. Who was this show written for? If you wrote it for people of a certain, let's say, woke nature, honestly, and I'll be very honest with you, there's nothing in the show that's overtly woke except for maybe the role that Galadriel plays. But then, the way that Galadriel's written is so disrespectful to that ideology that you didn't even write for the quote-unquote woke crowd. So who is this show written for? J.D. Payne and Patrick McKay? Well, congratulations, you two. You wrote a show for yourselves and you spent nearly $1 billion on it, all tale told. To write a fan fiction that should never have seen the light of day if you couldn't write it for anyone else other than yourselves. Know who your audience is so that way you can write to them. And when you're able to write to them, your story will be better received, and especially if you intend to sell it, it will sell better. This is why you need to know who your audience is, because if you don't know who they are, it becomes so much harder for your story to connect with them. Lesson number 2, respect. Oh boy. Okay, so I have a saying right here, and it's a saying that I've stuck to for years. You need your stories. Your stories need you, and the world needs your stories. And what I mean by that is, if you're someone who loves being a storyteller, you feel incomplete unless you're telling your stories. You have to finish your stories, or at least you have to work on them in some kind of way. You need your stories. And as you write and tell your stories, they start coming to life. But they can never be complete and whole without you. And believe it or not, the world needs your stories. Whether you're telling an awful story or a very good story, the world needs both. We learn from awful stories, and there is indeed a market and a crowd who loves awful things. But also we need good stories, because good stories really build us up, and great stories inspire people and motivate future generations of creators. So the world definitely needs your stories, no matter what they are. And so to that end, I actually say yes, the world needs the Rings of Power, if anything, to learn these valuable lessons and to learn what not to do. But let's say you actually want to write a great story, because I think that's what most creatives wish to do. If you wish to write a great story, it really comes down to respect. You must respect yourself as the artist. You must respect your characters, meaning that you do what is best for them. I see all this stuff about authors saying, oh, you've got to torture your characters. And I heard this again and again and again. We're going to torture Galadriel with all these sad things that happen to her. No, that does nothing for her character unless her character grows. And the show actively does everything in its power to prevent Galadriel from growing up as an individual. Therefore, the show does not respect its own main character, or any of the other characters for that matter. And then they do not respect the world. They do not respect their audience. I mean, we've seen all of this stuff play out, and yes, there are been disrespectful fans, but for crying out loud, learn how to actually act responsibly and respectfully to other people. And if you can't say anything nice, don't say nothing at all. You know how many rude comments I've gotten on videos here on YouTube? You know how many rude comments I've gotten for fan fictions that I've published? Do you know what people have said about my books that wasn't really nice to say? I've heard a lot of things. But you know what? I dealt with it. I learned how to act positively and creatively towards that, and to even learn from some of the stuff that was said, because sometimes the criticism is good. Sometimes it's what you need to hear. So you've got to be respectful. And I actually think that a really good, opposition to the Rings of Power in terms of respect is Call the Midwife. If you haven't seen this British show, it is actually really great. Go check it out on Netflix. It's all about midwives after World War II and throughout the years doing their job. And the show is incredibly respectful. It's respectful to the characters. This show deals with all kinds of really sensitive topics revolving around abortion, how to raise your children, contraceptives. I mean, you name it, this show has it. It really does. But the show is respectful to all of the characters. There are very, very few people who are lambasted as purely evil. Instead, the show takes time to look at every single point of view. And by doing this, they then actually show respect to the audience by saying, hey, look, we're not going to preach to you about any one way of doing things. The show does have an agenda in some episodes, but at the same time is respectful to opposing points of view and gives them a voice within the show, and then lets the characters within the show struggle and overcome. The show is incredibly respectful to its characters. It's incredibly respectful to its audience, unless I'm missing some really crazy Call the Midwife drama where the actresses are taking people to task online. I haven't heard anything about that. I haven't seen anything about that. So as far as I've been able to observe, the show has been respectful to its characters, to its audience, and that indicates that the writers have been respectful to themselves. Because if you can't respect other people, you are obviously not taking care of yourself on an emotional level that you need to. And if you're not taking care of yourself on a good emotional level, that will hinder your ability to work well as a writer. There are very, very few people who can be an Ernest Hemingway and be an awful individual and still crank out great stories. The fact of the matter is, very few people can manage that. And again, it ties back into the lesson of knowing your audience. If you know your audience, you have to be respectful to your audience. Because if you're not respectful to your audience, they will reject your story. Respect, respect, respect. I feel like in this world, a lot of people say, well, I'm not going to give any respect until people earn it. They've got to treat me with respect. Well, doesn't that go both ways? It's better to give that respect already to yourself, to your characters, to your story, and to your future audiences, or to your current audiences, so that way you can establish good relationships and write the best story that you can. Without respect, your story will fall apart. Lesson number 3, canon and continuity. Now then, this is actually something interesting right here. I'm kind of splitting hairs because canon and continuity definitely go hand in hand. However, I want you to think of it this way. Canon, or what we now keep on calling lore, and I'm not really a fan of that actually. Canon is the rules of your story. Canon is the history of your story. Canon is who your characters are. Canon is the events that happen within your story. That is there. That is what people can read, what they can see, what is objective fact within your story. That is canon. That is what provides the framework of logic for your world and its stories. And even if they're the most ridiculous things you have ever read, which if you read my books, The Legend of the Ten Lords, there's some wacky stuff that happens in those books, but it makes sense because of the canon that I have established. Therefore, it can make sense. You need solid canon that does not contradict itself, so that way you have a solid foundation of in-world logic to build the rest of your story on and around. If you don't have that foundation of canon, your story will fall apart. And that's one of the things that we see here with the Rings of Power, that because they obliterated the canon of Tolkien, they didn't respect it in any kind of way, they didn't utilize it the way that they should have, there's a lot of things that don't make any sense. So for the Tolkien fans, again, they just couldn't get into this show. Now for the people who aren't major Tolkien fans, that might not have been a problem because they didn't know the previous canon. Well, now we come down to continuity. Continuity is then what's happening as your story progresses. This means that the choices that your characters make should be in line and be consistent with choices that they've made in the past. If not, you must in story explain why they decide to do something differently. So let's say, for example, you got a character who loves their Diet Coke, and they buy a bottle of Diet Coke every day from their favorite Circle K as they're off on their way to work. Well, one day when they go to buy that Diet Coke, there's no Diet Coke there. Now the character is faced with a situation. Will they break their usual routine and go someplace else to get a Diet Coke? Will they go without a Diet Coke for the day? Or will they decide to drink Dr. Pepper instead? This is something really simple right here, but this allows you as the author then to show what kind of a situation would cause a character to do something that is not within line for what they normally do. If every chapter begins with the character going and getting themselves a Diet Coke and then suddenly they just start drinking Dr. Pepper out of nowhere, that is inconsistent. It doesn't make any sense. It breaks something that we understand about that main character. So having that scene at the Circle K where there is no Diet Coke helps us then to better understand why suddenly the change has been made. And maybe the character's like, oh, Dr. Pepper is more amazing than Diet Coke. I must drink more of it. More! And that then helps us to understand why a character has changed. Within the Rings of Power, let's once again look at Galadriel. Galadriel is a character who is absolutely inconsistent with her quote-unquote wisdom. She is absolutely driven by revenge. She says so even to Halbrand. And yet, later on, she's telling Theo, don't talk of such things. Don't think about murdering orcs. It blackens the heart. Okay then, now we're actually given something interesting here. Galadriel, so this you finally admitting that you've blackened your heart through revenge? That could be very interesting, could be very revealing. Do you now suddenly have a change of heart because of the defeat that you faced? Or do you realize that you've made a major mistake and you're trying to pass on now wisdom to a new generation so that way they don't repeat the mistakes of the past? Well, we're not given any sort of explanation. For a show that does a ton of talking, Galadriel never explains why she's come to that point. And in fact, again, the show through Theo's like, no, Galadriel, no, you're amazing, keep on slaying orcs. So that's what she proceeds to continue to do. She then continues on her path for vengeance. And this is strange right here because, if anything, it's consistent that Galadriel constantly pursues vengeance and does the wrong thing. At least she's being consistent there. But throughout the show, there's all of these different moments given to us where Galadriel could do something different, or says something different. She does something completely out of character. It doesn't make any sense why these moments are there. And if anything, it just serves for the audience to hate Galadriel even more. more. It identifies her as a villain. So if you consistently want her to come across as a villain, well, then you're doing really well, Rings of Power, but we know that's not what the show wanted to show. Another point of inconsistency would be Elrond. Is Elrond actually as intelligent as we hope him to be? Elrond is a great sleuth. He manages to figure out about Halbrand and where Durin is going and all this stuff. Elrond seems pretty smart, yet Elrond continues to make really stupid decisions. So we have inconsistencies in Elrond's intelligence. Also, when we look at the Harfoots, do you want the people to stay together, or are you trying to murder each other by banishing them? Do people not wander alone, or are you just going to leave people behind? The Harfoots are completely inconsistent with their own ideology about how they're supposed to work as a group, and as such, it breaks any sort of facade or understanding of them as a community, and it just served for people to hate the Harfoots even more. So if you don't have a good, solid foundation of canon, your story will fall apart under its own weight as you write it. Believe you me, it has happened. I've had to go back in some of my stories and completely reassess moments of world building in order to better justify certain things, because I realized this actually doesn't make any sense according to the canon that I've established. Or according to the canon that I've established, this really awesome scene that I wrote cannot work. So I have to ask myself, what do I want? The really cool scene or the canon? And usually I have gone with the canon and sacrificed the really cool scene, because that is better to hold true to your canon, because then you can still do awesome things within the parameter of your own world's logic, rather than break that logic and take people out of the experience by just serving up one chapter or one really cool scene at the cost of everything else that you've done. That's just stupid. And consistency. Consistency is key within your story. It must make sense from chapter to chapter to chapter why characters are doing what they're doing and how the plot is progressing. If it doesn't make any sense, you need to go back and fix it. This is where editing really comes in handy. Now, lesson number 4, and this is one that I've seen a lot of people complain about, and believe you me, it's irritated me as well. Time matters within your story. Time. What is time? Time is distance and speed. It is understanding how fast people get from point A to point B. How fast does the Earth go around the sun? How fast does one person get from their house to their job? How quickly can someone get from Mordor to Lindon? Stuff like this. How fast can people get from Numenor to Middle Earth? Okay then, awesome. We need to establish distance. We need to establish speed, and this better helps us to understand time. And once you've established what the speeds and the distances and the times are, you must stick to them. And believe you me, it can be annoying. I know it is annoying, because I've had to go back multiple times, especially in The Legend of the Ten Lords, and edit certain timelines because they did not line up with what I intended, because they did not originally in the second, third, or even in the first, second, or even the third draft really line up with what the timeline was supposed to be. It is easy to make those mistakes, but again, it is excellent. It behooveth you to go through and edit your story again and again to make sure that you get timelines right. And honestly, distance should matter. I actually make a point of this in one of my upcoming books about how one character who's a storyteller is like, man, there's really nothing good that happens when characters are traveling. Well, that's a bunch of bologna sandwich. There's a lot of things you can actually do as a storyteller with travel time. You can help to show that, hey, you know what? The distance really does matter. Or if a character is leaving home for a while, they have to leave for a month. A lot happens within a month's time, let alone if they've got to go on a years-long quest. Things change, and then that means when they come back home, well, people have changed. How easily are they going to reintegrate themselves back into the community? Or in the case of Halbrand being gutted and bleeding to death, okay, how long does it take for someone to bleed out and die? Well, maybe someone can live for a few days with a gut wound. Alright then, so that means we only have a couple of days to get Halbrand to elven healers, so that way we can heal his wound in his gut. Oh wait, we have hundreds of miles to cover. How are we going to cover that with regular horses? You can't. Well, let's get Shadowfax. Oh wait, we don't have a Shadowfax that we can use. So, you see then we have a problem right there. And if that is the case, then why then not do the simple thing and have Bronwyn actually pull out some miracle and heal Halbrand? Or how about using an elven spell to try to calm Halbrand down a little bit? Or talk about the haughtiness of men, that Halbrand pulls off an amazing feat by keeping himself alive. And that's something that's even actually brought up in The Lord of the Rings when Frodo is stabbed by a Morgul blade. Everyone's surprised that he survives as long as he does, and they say it's because hobbits are obviously made of sturdier stuff, and that Frodo's own sheer willpower pushes back the darkness that's acting like a poison within his body, but he still nearly succumbs and dies to it if it were not for Elrond and Gandalf managing to get to him in time. Time does matter. Speed matters. Distances matter. You need to understand that for any story that has any sort of travel in it, or any story that relies on a passage of time. If you don't understand the passage of time, it will screw up the immersion that people are experiencing within your story. It takes them out of the fantasy. Why? Because we experience time, speed, distance every single day. It is a part of our regular lives, and throughout all of fantasy, it's been the exact same way as well. So if you break the rules of time, and not in a cool time travel way, it messes up that immersion and takes people immediately out of your story. Lesson number 5, and I've already kind of addressed this right here: edit your first drafts. Go through the process. Now, I actually want to kind of get a little bit into the production for shows and movies right here. Something that, again, my teacher, Mr. Abel, back in high school said, and this is something that remains so true today: the best movies and the best commercials have storyboards. What is a storyboard? Well, a storyboard is where you've already written out your rough draft for your script. Maybe you've already edited your script a little bit. Well, what you do is you then take your script and you translate it into pictures. By translating it on into pictures, you are able to share with everyone else on the production team, from actors to cameramen to people who are doing the lighting to the set crew. You are communicating to them what this story is supposed to look like. But not only what it's supposed to look like, how it's supposed to flow. This is a really great way for people in the film industry to actually edit their story yet again and make sure that only the most important stuff gets onto the screen. Or if there are other details that they have in the script that they can't just simply speak, then the set designers and the costume designers and the cinematographer work together to then put those details into every shot. It is a team effort. I would love to know if J.D. Payne and Patrick McKay did any storyboarding. There was a recent article where people were let into the war room, and they saw a bunch of concept art. Concept art is cool. I love concept art. I've got concept art for my books. I love looking at it. But here's the thing. Concept art does not a story tell. And if you are making a show or making a movie, you have to be able to fully visualize how all of that concept stuff comes together to tell a cohesive story. This is where storyboarding really comes in. And as actually a kind of a little bit of a fun fact right here, Camille's harem was originally called the storyboard, or just simply storyboard. And one of the reasons why we called it the storyboard is because one of the things that we would actually do is we would, at the university, we would commandeer rooms with whiteboards, and we would write and draw up onto the whiteboards everything that we were intending to do for our book, or within certain scenes, or in certain chapters, or across a sequence of scenes and chapters. By doing this, we were able then to, as a group, look at one another's stories, evaluate them, and give feedback, helping to motivate one another and helping us to improve our stories together. Storyboards are a great way within the film industry to share these ideas, to edit your draft, and to make sure that the best story possible is told between everyone. Everyone is on the same page. When we look at the Rings of Power, there are definitely a lot of episodes that feel as though no one actually knew what was happening in the previous episode. Again, the consistency was nowhere. We were jumping all over the place with character decisions, with dialogue moments, with the feel, with the atmosphere. It was lacking. It feels like a bunch of different stories were cobbled together that made absolutely no sense on their own, and let alone all put together. By editing your story, you can find all of those precious gems that can be pulled out of the rough, cut and polished to then become a gleaming, beautiful story. And you know what? On its own merits, discounting Tolkien and everything, there's actually a lot of fun, interesting stuff in the Rings of Power as an original idea. The problem is that the entire show looks and feels like a first draft. As such, all of the good stuff is buried under the muck, and so it couldn't be the best story that it could be. Sure, all of us Tolkien fans could have absolutely hated it, but if it had been its own good original story, plenty of other people would have gotten into it. But because it was not edited to become the best that it could be, rather I feel like these people just shot stuff and said, fix it in post. Well, that doesn't work out. You can't just fix stuff in post. The best editing is the stuff that you do early on. And this is something that holds true for writing books. If you go for like 3 or 4 drafts without doing any real alterations to any of the story or really reconsidering anything, you're just simply cleaning up grammar mistakes and maybe making the pages look a little bit nicer, it actually becomes harder to do the proper procedural fixes to make the story the best that it can be. In the second and third drafts, you should really be taking the axe and the scalpel to your story, getting rid of stuff that doesn't work, putting in stuff that should, adding things, taking things away, making the characters be a little bit more streamlined or giving them some real depth, whatever it is you got to do. I'm right now working on one novel where, man, let me just tell you, I've kind of been all over the place with this right here. I have added in 4 new chapters, which I definitely did not intend to write at all, but it was what was needed, and there have been entire chapters or entire segments of chapters that have been like, man, I enjoyed writing this in the first draft, but it does not work here, and it hurts, but I've got to remove it because otherwise it just will not help the story out. In fact, it will help to destroy the story. That is why editing is so important, and that's why it's so crucial that you go through it again and again. Now, I understand that when it comes to running a show or to a movie, there are timelines involved. You only have so much time before you have to get the final product out there to the masses. That is what capitalism demands. This is also then why you have a room of writers, which I know J.D. Payne and Patrick McKay have. So why wasn't this room of writers working together to constantly evaluate each other's work and edit their scripts again and again? If they did not do it right. Because it still looks and sounds like a first draft. Lesson number 6. Write in-depth characters. Now then, you might then be wondering, okay, well you've just said write an in-depth character. Well, how am I supposed to do that, Lars? Well, that depends a lot on the story that you wish to tell. And one of the things that you have when it comes to, especially writing a book, is you have time. You have time and the power to get into a character's thoughts and elaborate. Explain why a character likes or doesn't like something, or why a character wishes that a certain relationship will work out. What are your character's fears? What are their hopes? What are their dreams? What ticks them off really early in the morning? What brand of coffee do they have to drink? Who's their best friend and why? Getting into those details, and you don't have to write an entire chapter about them, none whatsoever. Learning how to be concise is truly an art, but being able to give us those kinds of answers within the story, here and there, really helps to just bring some life to some of these characters. Again, coming back to my own works, in The Legend of the Ten Lords, I decided for one scene to bring out the fact that one character hates going camping because, well, he's had a bad habit of wetting the sleeping bag. And so in this medieval / Renaissance-ish world where he's got to be out on the road and he's got to be sleeping, he's like, I hate doing this. It's something that is absolutely inconsequential, but it gives a little bit of depth to the character. Now then, that pales in comparison to when I go into detail about the different relationships that he has, the antagonists that he's going up against, what are his fears, but giving all of these details from the mundane to the important really help to pull out the depth of a character. A character doesn't need to be something out of a Shakespearean tragedy to have depth. In fact, there's a lot of great comedy characters who have a lot of depth to them. In fact, the characters who have the most depth within a comedy are usually the ones that you're laughing the most with or at, because you understand them better. The more understanding you have of a character, of who they are, that is depth, and that creates connection between the story and the audience, which you absolutely want to have as a writer. When you look at the Rings of Power, well, okay, what does Bronwyn really want? What does she like? What does she not like? What's her favorite food? What's her favorite color? I mean, we can all come up with our various answers to this just based off what we've seen, but we're not given anything concrete. What about Rondir? What about Theo? The only thing we really know about Theo is that he's Mr. Sweaty, he hates mice, and he's addicted to the sword like he's addicted to cocaine. Which doesn't make him an in-depth character. It makes him an annoying character. What do we know about Galadriel? It was interesting because a lot of people got shocked when Galadriel shared the story about Celeborn, about how she met him and the last time that she saw him. And the thing is this, that even people who hate the character of Galadriel within the Rings of Power liked to talk about this scene, at least in some capacity, because it was the first time that we were given any true depth to this character other than revenge. Because depth is not one-dimensional. Depth is getting to know characters, and the more that your characters come to life as real individuals, the better your story will be. Now, lesson number 7. Kill your darlings or give them their own story. The concept of killing your darlings comes from Brandon Sanderson Senpai and his friends over at the podcast Writing Excuses, where they talked about, you know, sometimes there are characters or scenes or chapters or even entire segments of your story that you really, really like. You love them. Oh my gosh, you love them so much, but they just don't work. For some reason, they bog down the story, they break up the continuity, they break up the pacing, or they just don't fit within the atmosphere. And so you've got to give them the axe. That is essential right there. Now then, this doesn't mean that you have to get rid of that thing once and for all. In fact, actually, sometimes you can give that other thing its own story. My book, Bleed, Steam, and Steel, in part came about because for another book that I was working on, I really wanted to have this whole subplot with a warlord on this crazy dying steampunk world. And I was like, oh, I love this so much. But that subplot just in the end didn't work for the rest of the story. So I'm like, ah, dang it. So I cut it. I killed that darling. I took it out. But then I was like, wait, you know what? I really, really like this idea. And so I thought about it, and while I was taking care of my garden, I was just thinking, and it took on a whole new life of its own. And then boom, that's how I came up with the character Asuka, which then led to the rest of Bleed, Steam, and Steel. So sometimes killing your darlings within your own story doesn't mean that you just get rid of it forever or never look back. Sometimes that means removing it out of that story, giving it its own life, and then creating another separate story which works better for that character or that concept or that scene, whatever it was that you had to carve out. Now then, I'm going to be honest right here. As much as I hate the idea of the Harfoots, because it just completely goes against canon and they were so poorly written, there's actually some potential there. The problem is that it just took up way too much time within the show. It didn't really make any sense. It broke up the pacing, and it robbed the show of time that should have been dedicated to bringing the other characters more to life and developing all the other plots. The whole Harfoot story could have actually been its own little movie. You know what? They should have removed the whole Harfoot thing going on right there and actually have that then as a movie on the side that is released between seasons 1 and 2 to help make a connection to what they're going to do in season 2. Boom, there you go. You get your Harfoot story, and then by just focusing on the Harfoots, you can actually tell a more concise story, which might have actually improved the whole story of the Hobbits overall. And then hopefully you would have been able to use that time in the rest of the show to better the rest of the plots, bring depth to those characters, and work out all of the continuity and pacing problems. It might have actually really saved the show for a lot of people who weren't Tolkien fans, but were just looking for some good fantasy. So there's an advantage to killing your darlings or taking the darlings out and then giving them their own story. Lesson number 8. This comes directly from my editor. Read your story out loud. There is a legend, and I'm not sure how real it is, but I'm going to say it anyway, where in one of the original Star Wars movies, George Lucas handed the script over to Harrison Ford and said, okay, you're going to be saying this in the scene, and Harrison Ford said, no, I'm not going to say that. And George Lucas was like, but I wrote it. That's what needs to be said in the scene. And so they argued about it, and George Lucas was like, look, this is why what you're saying here makes sense. This is why you have to say it. To which Harrison Ford said, I get that, George, but no one would ever say it that way. So I'm not going to say that. And sometimes that's the way that it goes. And believe you me, it is humbling to read your story out loud, but it is also essential to read your story out loud. And I'll explain why. When you're reading things with your mind, just going on through, you're reading to yourself, well, you actually skip over a lot of words. Your mind just naturally fills everything else in to make sense of what you're looking at. We just do it instinctively. It doesn't mean that the story's bad by any means, it's just how we read. And that's one of the ways in which we actually engage with stories, is we fill in gaps, whether those gaps be just subconsciously made or gaps that naturally occur within the story, and then we subconsciously fill them in with our own imagination and the story comes to life for us. That's awesome, but what that means is when you're reading things silently, you're actually not reading every single individual word. And in fact, if you try doing that silently to yourself, you grow bored and frustrated very fast. Sometimes speaking out loud makes it easier for you to actually focus on the story as a whole. Another thing that happens is this, is that sometimes you can have written a grammatically perfect sentence, but it still doesn't sound good when you say it out loud. This especially happens for when you're writing dialogue. Dialogue is tricky to write. Dialogue is one of those things that prevented me from getting into writing far earlier because I just sucked at writing it. I was afraid of writing it because I'm like, I don't know how to write good conversations between people. As someone who stuttered as a kid and then had a hard time really connecting with people for some of my formative years, it was hard to imagine what a good conversation would be like other than a conversation with myself. And writing a conversation with yourself, having two characters who sound exactly alike speaking to each other, is boring. It's bad. So you want to be able to write characters who have distinct personalities having a conversation with one another. One of the ways that you can manage to have that distinctive feel for each character and have a good flowing conversation is to read those conversations out loud, to have those conversations out loud. Brandon Mole says that anyone who comes over to his house thinks that he's going insane because he is holding conversations with himself down in his basement. That's how he works out dialogue. That's not how I do it. I write down what I feel works in the moment, and then I read through it. I'm like, okay, so what worked, what didn't, and then I edit from there to try to make a good, cohesive, comprehensive, and engaging, fun conversation. Sometimes it can get really difficult, especially when that conversation has a whole lot of world building to it. And if that's the case, if you have a conversation that revolves around world building, you have to know how to make that conversation concise, so that way you don't get bored reading it. Because, I mean, you might feel engaged in it, but if you have paragraph after paragraph after paragraph of talking, that is boring. And then also, having people speak your words out loud can really help you to hear what might just not sound colloquial or syntaxically, if that's a word, what sounds right either in a colloquial way or in a syntax way. So yes, please read your story out loud. It's humbling, I know. It's embarrassing, I know, but you have to do it. It really, really will help you out. Lesson number 9. Angst and sexual tension are not romance. I said this in one of my earlier videos about the Rings of Power, that one of the things I was actually really looking forward to was the romance between Arondir and Bronwyn. I like the idea of a male elf falling in love with a mortal woman. I think that that's a cool idea. It's not something that you normally see, because it's normally the handsome, rugged dude from the human race getting all of the chicks from the immortal or longer-lived races. You see that all the time. It's a staple in fantasy, so it's very rare to see it the other way around. I was excited for that. But in the end, what did I get? I got a bunch of awkward placing of hands, awkward breathing, stuff that we say, kind of in cryptic code. We stare at each other. Say something Shakespearean to me, baby. That is not romance. Weird looks at each other, awkwardness, looking away when the other person sees you, that's middle school stuff. That is angst. That is not a real romance. That's a crush. And it was awkward watching Arondir and Bronwyn because it was like watching a middle school crush unfold between two adults. That's bad. I wanted this romance to work out, and there's only one moment in the entire show, and that's up on the tower where they actually share about 10 seconds of actual good conversation and a real physical touch that I could buy as they're like trying to comfort each other with that touch before other things start happening. But all the rest of their interactions were wooden. It didn't make any sense. The dialogue was bad. And they were really going for angst. And you especially get that with Galadriel and with Halbrand. As we now know, Sauron. So Halron, Hal Sauron, Hail Sauron! It was all bad because Galadriel's just like, oh, you know how to kill. That slightly turns me on. He's like, you are a slightly attractive woman who is very overbearing. I also find that mildly attractive, I guess. Oh, you're powerful. I like power. And the whole weird flirtatious scene there in the last episode where he holds her chin and everything like that. No, that's sexual assault right there. That was borderline sexual assault. It was bad sexual tension. It didn't work. Romance is hard to write. Believe you me, I get it. I absolutely understand that. It's hard to figure out exactly what will work for people because romance is largely subjective. The way I fall in love is not the way other people fall in love. The things that I do to show love is not what other people would do or say. And each relationship out there in the world is unique to the people who are in it. And that does make writing a romance that reaches out to other people, well, kind of difficult. But again, that comes back to writing in-depth characters. If you're able to write characters who have real depth, it then becomes easier to write good friendships. Any good romance should be built on a basis of friendly understanding between two or multiple characters. This allows the characters to have a basis of understanding that leads to good dialogue, that leads to inside jokes or inside understanding, things that they don't like about one another, things that they really love about one another, and those are things then that you tap into as you are writing a growing or already present romance. And yeah, there's a whole lot more that goes on into it, but angst is not romance. Weird little glances at each other, awkward hand-holding, saying one or two things that might sound impactful but really aren't, is not romance. Romance is the long, hard slog. It is constantly having characters show again and again that they care for a character, why they care, and how they care. Writing a romance is about having those mile markers throughout the story that constantly show someone why they love another person. And when I think about in the Rings of Power, really, there's no mile markers for Arondir or Bronwyn, and the mile markers that are there for Galadriel and Sauron are basically established more in hindsight, and everything else between them is just really angsty. It becomes even more awkward when you realize that Galadriel's still married to Celeborn, and that because we don't see a body, he's very likely still alive. So yeah, her then falling for Sauron is bad. It's just, it was all done so wrong. It was effectively an angsty relationship, and it just sucks. My 10th and final lesson for this video is this. Pandering to your characters stunts their growth. And I am looking at you, Galadriel, and I'm also looking at you, Bronwyn. Because let's first look at Bronwyn right here. So Bronwyn goes from single mother healer who lives outside of the town, which makes no sense because you'd want to have the healer in town, going from basically a nobody who everyone knows is sleeping around with an elf, to becoming this leader of the men of the South. Okay, awesome. You know what? You could do something with that story. However, Bronwyn shows no real leadership. She actually makes bad decisions. She proves herself to be a coward. She's not a good fighter in any kind of way. She's uninspiring as a leader. And yet the show, at every possible turn is like, oh, you've kept us together. You have led us. You've kept these people alive. Again and again and again. When that's definitely not what the show has shown us. And in fact, here's the thing. You don't need a character to say that to another character. It needs to be something that is proven to the audience. Again, I'm going to look at some of my own stories right here. One of my main characters in The Legend of the Ten Lords, Ben, starts off as just your typical teenager and he grows to become a hero. Throughout the story, he makes plenty of mistakes. And the one who holds himself accountable for that is himself and also the reader. There are some characters who are like, oh, no, you're all good, and they try to help him out. But he needs to believe that for himself. It can't just be told to him and then he accepts it and moves on. anyone who just accepts that kind of stuff being told to them is someone who actually doesn't grow in real life, because they're just being told that they're awesome without having to show that they are awesome. And for a character like Ben, his real triumph is when he shows that he can overcome his weaknesses, where he can make up for his mistakes and bad choices, and where he can really be a hero. For Bronwyn needed to have a moment where she herself realized that she was being a good leader, even though the show shows us none of that. It would have been better for the show to have Bronwyn as a capable leader who rises up to the challenge and shows those qualities, which she never does. And then to have a moment herself where it's not even said, but you just see it on her face, where she can maybe she sees after the hard-won battle against Adar that she's like maybe it's something like, we kept most of them alive. And just like have that be the thing where it's like she realizes that she managed it. She managed to keep most of her people alive. Now, granted, that's before the volcano comes and kills everyone, but hey, that would have been a moment that would have really cemented to the audience and to Bronwyn that she actually succeeded. That would have been a more powerful moment. You don't need to pander to a character through other characters. This issue is especially egregious with Galadriel, who is constantly making mistake after mistake after mistake, and yet you have Halbrand, who at first doesn't trust Galadriel as being all like, I trust you, I'm going to give you advice, and then telling Farazan, oh, you wouldn't want to do that, she's much too powerful for you, you can't defeat her. And then the Queen of the Númenóreans being like, okay, I'm going to give you everything that you need, even though I've just told you that I wanted to get you off my island. Or with Theo being all like, no, you're great, you didn't do anything wrong. With so many characters telling her that she's done nothing wrong. It's pandering, pandering, pandering. And this was so weird because this is something that has become very prevalent, not just in writing, but just overall in modern culture. This idea of validation or self-validation. That you need validation in order to appreciate yourself and the work that you put into something. And I get it. We all want to be praised. And you know what? You should be praised for the things that you managed to accomplish, especially if that's something that was very difficult for you. You deserve good, healthy praise. But praise is earned. Pandering is what is just given to validate you. Validation in its healthiest form is praise that is earned, and it's an understanding for yourself that you succeeded, or even if you failed, that you gave it your best. It's one of the reasons why good sports films are just always so touching and powerful, even if you don't play the sport, because the validation is absolutely earned for those characters. Sports films do it great. Sports shows do it great. I love it. Why is it then so hard here? Well, it's because we've gotten so used to, as a society and within our fiction, of just writing these pandering scenes. It's what some people say, it's walking and talking in hallways, or sitting and talking at coffee tables, or talking at, or lying down and talking in bed. It's these moments where characters are receiving validation or insight from another character that's like, okay, I've given you this thing that I've spoken to you, and now you're going to be a better character for it. And then we go into the next scene, and they're now suddenly a better character. They've become better just because they were told something? That very rarely works in real life, and it shouldn't really work often in fiction. It can work, again, if that information is hard-fought and hard-won. Let's think about it in terms like of Harry Potter. Harry finally manages to face Voldemort at the end of the Deathly Hallows with information that allows him to confront death because he's gone through the entire quest. He has learned and grown as an individual. If the truths that Snape and Dumbledore share with him were shared to him back in Book 1, Book 2, or even in Book 6, Harry might not have been ready to face Voldemort and willingly let himself be killed, which was essential to destroying Voldemort. So receiving information from another character can be really good. Receiving validation and praise is definitely good, but it must be earned. When you look at the Rings of Power, honestly and truly, tell me, especially when it comes to Galadriel, when did Galadriel earn any of the praise that she got? Did she actually deserve any of that? All of the things that she does within this show are manipulative, are self-destructive, are destructive to other people, and yet the show continues to pander to her, telling her that she's the greatest thing since sliced bread. In fact, she was the greatest thing before sliced bread. So it's just simply pandering, and that's bad. That's false validation, that's false praise. And that grates on the audience. It disrespects the audience. It disrespects your characters. It comes back to knowing your audience and showing respect. And one of the best ways that you can show that is not by validating your characters through pandering, but rather forcing your characters to do stuff in order to earn those moments. When they talked about putting Galadriel through all of this pain and suffering to become the woman that she's supposed to be, I don't see any of that here in this show. Instead, I just see pandering. Her growth has been stunted. If you want a character to grow, you put that character through challenges. We don't torture our characters because we find it fun. We put our characters through challenges that hurt them and cause them to question themselves and question things around them because they need to learn strength, they need to learn resolve, they need to learn the truth, and they need to learn to rely on themselves and rely on the people that they can count on in order to progress through the plot. That goes for drama, that goes for tragedy, that goes for comedy, that goes for sci-fi, that goes for fiction, that goes for adventure, that goes for romance. It goes for all stories. Why? Because that is the human condition. That is the human experience. And if your human experience has been getting pandered to all your life, you are going to be a weak individual. That's not just me being, oh, like here I am on my high horse. That is psychologically proven. That is scientifically proven. And we have known that even before science started telling us in the 20th century, in the 21st century. We have known that for millennia. That is why it is an essential element to the hero's journey, which is a universal form of storytelling that connects to everyone regardless of their age, their culture, their race, or anything. That is what it means to be human. It is a human experience. Whew, I got a little bit passionate right there. And that's because, look, I want people to be able to write great stories. I said that the world needs your stories, the bad, the good, and the great. And while we need bad stories from time to time to help us improve, and good stories are just fun to have, great stories are what inspire people to move onwards. And we really need great stories right now. We need to be able to inspire a whole new generation of creatives. We need to be able to inspire the current generation, and we need to inspire the generation coming after us, because that is how we keep values alive. That is how we keep stories alive, and that's what allows us to actually push the boundaries in ways where we can healthily grow as a society. That way we can preserve the things that are good about ourselves, and we can then be introspective about the things that we need to fix about ourselves. Stories are a beautiful thing that inspire us, that help us to feel things, that help us to see things that we wouldn't otherwise be able to feel or see about ourselves, about the world around us, about other people. Stories are incredible, but if we do not treat stories correctly, if we do not treat them with respect, if we don't write them or tell them well, that important element of storytelling will erode to the point where we cease to inspire each other as we should. We are a grand community of fans, of authors, of creatives and listeners here on YouTube, of citizens of the world. We are a great human community, and we should be able to inspire each other and do great things for each other. Stories lift us up, and that's something that has been known for millennia. Why is it now that we seek to subvert storytelling for pandering and silliness and just giving ourselves a pat on the back and doing it for the big bucks? Capitalism has existed for a long time, I get that, and we all seek validation, and it's nice to take the easy way out every now and then, but it's become such an endemic issue that we see this all throughout modern storytelling, that it has degraded our ability to tell stories. And honestly, that's why we're here as Camille's Harem. And that's why I'm so upset with the Rings of Power. Not just as a Tolkien fan, but as someone who wants to be entertained, as someone who wants to be inspired, and as an author myself, and as a creative here on YouTube, I want to be inspired. And yet the Rings of Power is anything but to me. And what I see from so many other people, tens of millions of individuals around the world have felt the exact same way and have rejected this story. And that has honestly hurt storytelling as a whole, unless we can learn from this disaster, which is why I've made this video, which is why I spent the last hour or so ranting about these 10 lessons that we can take away from this garbage, from this dumpster fire that we call a show. Because I hope that for all of the hours that all of us have put into the Rings of Power, even if we never watched a single episode, if we just spent time listening to what other people have said, or we took time watching it and enjoying it or hating it, or taking time to watch it to then make videos or to write articles or what have you, my hope is that we can actually learn and benefit from this story, so that way we, as creators in our own rights, can show respect to our stories, because our stories need us, we need them, and the rest of the world needs our stories. I still believe that. Alright, so I'm going to wrap it up there. I'm closing the door on the Rings of Power. I've talked with some other people and said like I would do a little bit of research into how well the book sales have gone for The Lord of the Rings since the show has gone on. I would probably say that a lot of that data is going to come out later on, but after doing a little bit of research, no one's talking about it. There's no articles, no nothing. It looks as though the book sold really well before the show came out, and I think mostly based off of what reviews I've read and what articles I've read, that's mostly because people were trying to get the old copies of the books before Amazon's copies flooded the market, and those copies aren't selling. So that's what I've seen, and that's mostly just old fans. No new fans have been brought to really enjoy Tolkien. A lot of people are like, you know what, maybe I don't want to be a part of this fan base. Maybe I don't want to get into this because this all seems really weird and toxic, and that's sad. And granted, that opens up a can of worms to a whole other conversation about creatives versus fans and so forth. And I'm just going to say I side with the fans on this one just because of how bad the show was. If the show was any good, then this would be a much murkier topic to discuss. And, well, we'll just see how things unfold. But from what I'm seeing right now, no, this show did not bring people in to enjoy Tolkien. Book sales have not gone up. Maybe some data will show us otherwise in the oncoming months, but thus far I wasn't able to find anything about that. And as far as the news about the second season already being under production, I know they haven't edited anything, they haven't changed anything, they're going full steam ahead, because the real pain and panic isn't going to hit them until they're well underway in production. And then they're just going to once again try to fix it in post, because they didn't do the proper pre-production ahead of time. So as a result, season 2 is probably going to suck. Will I watch season 2? Maybe. I honestly don't know. I don't know if I can give a solid answer on that yet, because I spent so many hours with this show. So many hours that I could have spent with other stories. It's one of the reasons why I started offering up other stories as alternatives to the Rings of Power. Stories that I knew would be far more entertaining than this tripe. So we'll see what happens. I can't say just yet. Chances are I'll probably watch at least a couple of episodes just to see if I'm going to hate watch it and rip it apart here on YouTube, or if I'm just gonna be like, yeah, you know what, it's definitely not worth it. Let's focus on much better things in this world. I am looking forward to the War of the Rohirrim, and I've already done a quick video as to why, which I'll make sure that I link in the description, so that way you can go check it on out. But I am excited to see that. I'm very interested in seeing what an anime adaptation will look like for Middle-earth, for the Lord of the Rings. And it looks like they're treating the source material pretty respectfully, and really, the War of the Rohirrim, the fall of Helm Hammerhand, is absolutely something that would resonate with the samurai culture, and the idea of fighting to the very last to preserve your honor and everything like that. That definitely works for Japanese storytelling, so handing it off to Japanese creatives to help create the story could work out really well. Don't know yet, we'll see what happens in the long run, so I will review that when that comes around, but I am excited to see that. I'm not opposed to adaptations, and I really do want to see more of Tolkien's Middle-earth come to the forefront. Yes, I know that it's going to be used as a cash cow, and that's something that we're just going to have to accept. Christopher Tolkien is dead and gone. It now comes down to the fans to decide what they're really going to support and what they're not. And you know what, to be all honest, that's how myth works. Once Homer was dead and gone, who kept on the stories of the Odyssey and so forth? Who did that? It was other storytellers who were like, people like this. I'm going to continue to tell it. Myth evolves over time, and we'll see what happens. I mean, we probably won't be alive to see what the end game will be, but this is just the natural process of storytelling. And I'm encouraged by how fans have responded both positively and negatively to the stuff that is coming out, that it looks as though Tolkien's legacy is not going to fracture. And you honestly cannot steal from Tolkien what he did. This show, The Rings of Power, will never destroy Tolkien. Tolkien is a bastion of awesomeness and of creativity, and is a rock of foundation to modern fantasy that, until someone somehow supersedes him in quality and in just sheer genius, Tolkien cannot be destroyed. Fantasy will not be destroyed. We'll go through periods of dearth and plenty, but you can't get rid of Tolkien that easily. His legacy remains. And it'll be very interesting to see where things go on from here. So, those are all of my closing thoughts on the matter. If you're looking for good, solid writing advice rather than just the stuff I have here in this video, please feel free to check out our other videos here on Camille's Harem. You can also head on over to our podcast, found on Podbean, iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, the works. We have writing exercises for all you new authors out there over our Pinterest page, and of course, we would love for you to join our growing community of novice authors. Links for all of that and more are in the description below. And until the next video, y'all, thank you for joining us on this adventure that we call writing, and tschüss.